Rain fell over the palace of the Keswick Dominion, soft and steady, tapping against the domed glass roof above the royal garden. Inside the garden, under a canopy of silver trees, an empty enclosure sat open to the storm. Guards stood frozen around it, their weapons lowered, their faces pale under the flashing lights of alarm. The sacred beast was gone. Its name was Vanter, and for 300 years it had lived within these walls, never once stepping past the garden gates. It was larger than any building in the human settlements, with skin that glowed faintly blue in the dark, like a living lantern. The Keswick people believed Vanter carried the spirit of their ancestors, and that its presence blessed the king's rule. To lose it was more than a disaster. It was a sign that something was deeply wrong. King Dorlan arrived within minutes, his long coat still damp from his own chambers. He said nothing at first. He only stared at the broken latch on the enclosure gate, then at the soft trail of pressed grass leading toward the outer wall. "There was no attack," said one of the guards quietly. "No forced entry. It just left." Dorlan's jaw tightened. He had ruled for 20 years, and never had Vanna shown any sign of wanting to leave. The beast was calm, gentle, and famously uninterested in the world beyond its garden. For it to vanish without struggle meant only one thing. It had chosen to go. "Search everywhere," Dorlan said, quietly. "I do not want this reaching the colonies, especially the human sector. If word spreads that the sacred beast abandoned the palace, they will say I have lost the favor of our ancestors." The guards nodded and scattered into the rain. Commander Vesa, a sharp-eyed officer with years of loyal service, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if the beast left on its own, it may have sensed something. Beasts like Vanner are known to react to emotion. Fear, anger, tension." Dorlan's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting my court frightened it away?" Vesa hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I am suggesting we should search with open minds, not just open weapons." The king did not answer. He turned and walked back into the palace, his boots echoing against the marble floor, his mind heavy with worry he refused to show. Far beyond the palace walls, past the shining towers of the capital city, past the farmlands and transport routes, was a quieter part of the world, a colony shared by several species, where humans had only recently been allowed to settle. It was a place of small homes, simple fields, and slower days. In one such home, on the edge of a wide grain field, a man named Daniel Hayes was fast asleep. Daniel was not important by any measure the Keswick court would recognize. He owned no titles, held no political power, and lived alone except for a small dog named Biscuit who slept curled near the fireplace. Daniel had been a caretaker back on Earth, tending to injured animals at a countryside shelter before he decided to leave old memories behind and start fresh among the stars. He liked the colony because it was peaceful. No one asked him about his past. No one expected anything grand from him. That night, the storm that soaked the palace gardens had drifted far across the land, reaching even the quiet colony. Rain hammered against Daniel's roof, and thunder rumbled low over the fields. Biscuit whimpered and pressed closer to the fire. Daniel woke briefly, listening to the storm, then drifted back to sleep, unaware that something enormous was moving through the dark outside. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the fields damp and glistening under a pale sun. Daniel woke slowly, stretching as sunlight crossed his bed. Biscuit was already awake, standing rigid near the window, growling softly at something outside. "What is it, boy?" Daniel murmured, sitting up. Biscuit did not stop growling. Daniel rose and walked to the window, peering out through the morning mist. At first he saw nothing unusual, just his fields, his fence, the old wooden shed at the edge of the yard. Then he saw it. Curled beside his porch, half hidden under the roof's overhang, was a massive shape unlike anything he had ever seen. Its skin shimmered faintly, catching the early light in soft waves of blue. It was larger than his house, its body coiled tightly to fit into the narrow shelter, as if it had sought shelter from the storm the same way a stray animal might. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. For a long moment, he simply stared, his mind racing through every possible explanation. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't moving at all, except for the slow rise and fall of its breathing. He should have been afraid. Later, he would wonder why he wasn't. Instead, Daniel found himself thinking of the animals he used to care for back on Earth. frightened creatures who came to him injured, lost, or abandoned, needing nothing more than patience and a calm hand. Something about the way this creature curled itself small, trying not to take up too much space, reminded him of that. He opened his door slowly, stepping out into the cool morning air. Biscuit barked once, then fell silent, watching cautiously from the doorway. The great creature's eyes opened. They were large, golden, and strangely gentle, studying Daniel with an intelligence he had not expected. It did not growl. It did not move to attack. It simply watched him, waiting. "Okay," Daniel said softly, raising his hand slowly. "You're not here to hurt me, are you?" The creature let out a low, rumbling breath, almost like a sigh of relief. It shifted slightly, curling even closer to the house, as though seeking comfort rather than escape. Daniel had no idea that hundreds of miles away, an entire kingdom was tearing itself apart searching for this very creature. He had no idea that this animal was sacred to an empire, worshipped as a living blessing upon a king's crown. All he knew was that something big, tired, and gentle had come to his home seeking shelter, and it was looking at him now with quiet trust. He knelt down slowly, keeping his movements calm. "All right," he said, "let's get you something to eat." Far away, in the halls of the Keswick Palace, King Dorlin received the first report of a strange creature spotted near the human settlement sector. He read it twice before setting the paper down, his expression unreadable. The search had just begun. Word travels fast in a small colony, even faster than it does in a palace full of secrets. By the time the sun had fully risen over Daniel's fields, two of his neighbors had already seen the enormous creature resting beside his porch, and by mid-morning, half the settlement had heard the news. Daniel didn't understand the fuss right away. To him, the creature was simply a large, gentle animal that had wandered in from the storm. He had spent the early hours bringing it buckets of water and scraps of food from his own kitchen, unsure what it liked to eat, but trying anyway. The creature accepted everything he offered with quiet patience, nudging its huge head against his hand every so often, as if thanking him. By the time Mira Doyle, the settlement's postal courier, arrived at his gate with wide eyes and a shaking voice, Daniel finally understood that something was very wrong. "Daniel," she said, breathless, "do you know what that is?" "An animal that got lost in the storm?" Daniel guessed, glancing back at the creature, who was now watching Mira with mild curiosity. Mira shook her head firmly. "That's not just an animal. That's the sacred beast of the Keswick Dominion. It belongs to the king himself. I saw an image of it once during a diplomatic broadcast. Daniel, this thing is worshipped." Daniel blinked, looking between Mira and the creature, trying to process what she was saying. "Worshipped? It's just been sitting here since last night. It didn't say anything about being royal." "They can't talk in our language," Mira said. "But everyone knows about Vander. If the Keswick officials find out it's here, they're going to come looking for it. Probably very soon." As if summoned by her words, a low hum echoed across the fields, an engine sound, distant but growing louder. Daniel and Mira turned toward the sky, where three sleek Keswick patrol vehicles were descending toward the settlement, moving with clear purpose. "They already know," Daniel murmured. The vehicles landed just beyond his fence, kicking up dust and flattening the tall grass. Doors slid open, and several armored Keswick soldiers stepped out, led by a tall, stern woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence. She wore the insignia of the Royal Guard, and her gaze locked immediately onto the massive creature resting beside Daniel's porch. "Vanter," she said, her voice carrying both relief and disbelief. She turned toward Daniel. "Human, step away from the beast immediately." Daniel hesitated, glancing at the creature, whose golden eyes had opened again, watching the soldiers approach with attention Daniel hadn't seen in it before. "I don't think it wants to go anywhere," Daniel said carefully. The commander's eyes narrowed. "This is not a matter of what it wants. This creature belongs to the king's royal court. It disappeared from the palace during last night's storm, and its absence has caused great concern throughout the empire. I am here to bring it home." She stepped forward, raising a device meant to guide the beast back into the transport vehicle. The moment she moved closer, Vanter let out a deep, rumbling growl, curling its massive body protectively, placing itself between the soldiers and Daniel's house. The commander froze, clearly startled. "Stand down," she ordered, though it wasn't clear if she meant the soldiers or the beast. Vanta did not stand down. Its growl deepened, and the ground beneath it seemed to vibrate slightly with the sound. The soldiers raised their weapons instinctively, though none of them fired. "Wait," Daniel said quickly, stepping forward with his hands raised. "Please, don't. It's not attacking you. It's scared." The commander glanced at him, clearly unused to being told what to do by a human. "This creature does not feel fear. It is a sacred beast, blessed by the ancestors, chosen to protect the king's bloodline." "Maybe," Daniel said, keeping his voice calm and steady, the same tone he used to use with frightened animals back on Earth. "But right now, it looks pretty scared to me. Look at how it's positioned. It's not trying to fight. It's trying to protect itself. And maybe protect me too." The commander studied the beast carefully, noting the way its body curled defensively, the way its eyes darted nervously between the soldiers and Daniel. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across her stern expression. "This is highly unusual," she said quietly, almost to herself. One of the younger soldiers stepped closer to her. "Commander Vesa, should we proceed with capture?" Vesa held up a hand, silencing him. She studied Daniel for a long moment, taking in his simple clothes, his modest home, the way he stood without fear despite being surrounded by armed soldiers and an enormous alien creature. "You are not afraid of it," she said, more of an observation than a question. "No," Daniel admitted. "Should I be?" Vesa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned back to Vanter, who had calmed slightly now that the soldiers had lowered their weapons, though it remained close to Daniel, its body still angled protectively. "This is not how sacred beasts behave," Vesa muttered. "They do not run from the palace. They do not defend strangers. Something is very wrong here." She raised a communicator to her ear, speaking quietly in the Keswick language, relaying details back to someone at the palace. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone: confusion, uncertainty, and something else. Concern. After a long moment, Vesa lowered the communicator and looked at Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read. "We will not take the beast by force today," she said finally. "But this matter is far from settled. The king himself will want answers." She turned to her soldiers, ordering them back into the vehicles, though she cast one last glance toward Daniel and Vanter before leaving. As the patrol ships lifted off and disappeared into the sky, Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Vanter shifted beside him, releasing a low, tired sound, and gently rested its massive head near Daniel's feet, as though finally able to relax. Daniel knelt down slowly, placing a hand on the creature's warm, glowing skin. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe." Neither of them knew it yet, but their story had only just begun. News of the encounter spread through the Keswick palace like fire through dry grass. By evening, every noble, priest, and advisor in the royal court had heard some version of the story, that the sacred beast had fled to the human settlement, and worse, that it had refused to return, defending a human against the king's own soldiers. King Dorland sat alone in his private study, staring at the report Commander Vesa had sent. He read it 3 times, each time hoping the words might change, but they remained the same. Vanta had growled at armed guards. Vanta had shielded a human. Vanta had chosen to stay. A knock came at his door. High Priestess Sela entered without waiting for permission, her long robes trailing behind her, her expression troubled. "You have heard, then?" Dorland said, not looking up. "The entire court has heard," Sela replied. "Some are calling it an omen. Others are calling it a disgrace. A few are even questioning your right to rule, though none dare say it to your face." Dorland finally looked up, his eyes tired. "And what do you believe it means?" Sela hesitated before answering. "I believe sacred beasts do not act without reason. They are not simple animals, Your Majesty. They are deeply empathic creatures, sensitive to the emotions around them. If Vanter fled the palace, it fled something it could no longer bear to feel." Dorland's jaw tightened. "Are you saying my court frightened it away?" "I am saying," Sela said carefully, "that the palace has grown tense in recent years. Rivalries among the nobles, whispers of ambition, fear of failure. Perhaps Vanter felt all of it, day after day, until it could not stay any longer." The king said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. He had felt the same tension himself, the constant political maneuvering, The endless suspicion between advisors who smiled to his face while plotting behind his back. If even he found it exhausting, perhaps it was no surprise that a creature as sensitive as Vanter had finally reached its limit. And the human? Dorlin asked quietly. Why would it choose to stay with him? Sela shook her head. I do not know yet, but I intend to find out. The next morning, Sela traveled to the human settlement herself, accompanied by 2 scholars and a small security escort. She arrived to find Daniel tending his fields as usual, with Vanter resting peacefully nearby, its massive form curled beneath the shade of a large tree. Daniel straightened as the group approached, wiping dirt from his hands. More visitors, he said, glancing warily at the priestess's elaborate robes. I am not here to take the beast, Sela said quickly, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. I only wish to understand. Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, ask away. Sela walked closer to Vanter, watching carefully as the creature lifted its head, studying her with calm golden eyes. Unlike its reaction to the soldiers the day before, it did not growl or tense. It simply watched, patient and curious. May I approach? Sela asked Daniel. That's up to Vanter, not me, Daniel replied. But it seems calm right now. Sela stepped closer, kneeling slowly beside the great creature, placing a gentle hand against its glowing skin. She closed her eyes, murmuring something in the old Keswick tongue, a ritual Daniel didn't understand. After a long moment, she opened her eyes again, looking almost startled. What is it? Daniel asked. I can feel it, Sela said softly. Peace. Real peace. I have never felt this from Vanter before, not even within the palace gardens. She turned to Daniel, studying him with new interest. Tell me about yourself. Daniel shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. There's not much to tell. I used to take care of injured animals back on Earth. Wild ones, mostly. Strays that got hurt or lost. I did that for years before coming out here. And why did you leave? Sela asked. Daniel hesitated, his eyes drifting toward the horizon. Earth got complicated. Too much noise, too much competition, too many people trying to prove they were better than everyone else. I just wanted somewhere quiet. Somewhere I could take care of things without everyone watching or judging. Sela nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. You sought peace, just as Vanda did. I guess so, Daniel admitted. Sela rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her robes, her mind racing with implications. Sacred beasts are drawn to calm, selfless spirits. It is written in the old texts, though few remember them anymore. Vanda did not run from the palace randomly. It sought out the first being whose presence felt safe, patient, and free of hidden ambition. Daniel frowned. You're saying it chose me because I'm calm? I am saying you may be exactly what Vanta needed, Sela replied. And that is a truth the king himself must hear. Back at the palace, Sela's report caused an uproar unlike anything seen in decades. Nobles debated furiously over what it meant for a sacred beast to abandon royal care for a human farmer's humble home. Some called it an insult to the crown. Others whispered that perhaps the beast's choice revealed uncomfortable truths about the court itself. King Dorlin listened to every argument in silence, his expression unreadable, though inwardly his thoughts churned with doubt. He had spent 20 years ruling through strength, tradition, and careful political balance. Now, a single creature's simple choice threatened to unravel everything he believed about his own reign. That night, alone in his chambers, Dorlin stared out at the storm clouds gathering once again over the capital, the same storm that had once carried Vanner far from home. What did you feel? He whispered to the empty room. That you could not feel here. No answer came, but deep down, he suspected he already knew. The following morning, against the advice of every advisor in his court, King Dorlin made a decision that would shock the entire empire. He announced he would travel to the human settlement himself. The announcement spread through the palace within hours, and by nightfall, it had reached every corner of the capital. The king intended to leave his throne, his guards, and the safety of his palace to travel personally to a small human settlement on the edge of the colony sector. No king of the Keswick Dominion had ever done such a thing. The royal council gathered in emergency session, their voices overlapping in a chaos of concern and disapproval. This is beneath the crown, argued Lord Thran, an elderly noble with sharp features and sharper opinions. A king does not chase after a runaway animal like a common herder. It is not merely an animal, Sela reminded him firmly. It is the sacred beast, and its choice has already shaken the foundations of this court. Perhaps the king wishes to understand why. Or perhaps, muttered another advisor, he simply wishes to reclaim what was lost before the humans grow too comfortable holding something that does not belong to them. Dorlan, seated at the head of the long council table, listened without interrupting. When the arguments finally quieted, he rose slowly, his presence commanding silence. I have ruled this empire for 20 years, he said. I have followed every tradition, honored every ritual, and maintained the strength of this crown through careful control. And yet, in a single night, a creature I have protected since birth chose to leave everything I offered it for the home of a stranger it had never met before. He paused, letting his words settle over the room. I intend to understand why, not as a king demanding answers, but as a man seeking truth. No one dared argue further. The journey to the human settlement took less than a day, though for Dorlan, it felt far longer. He traveled with only a small escort, dressed in simple traveling clothes rather than his usual royal attire, hoping to observe without drawing attention. It was a strange sensation, stepping outside the palace walls without the weight of ceremony surrounding him. When he arrived at the edge of Daniel's property, he saw Vanter first, resting peacefully in the afternoon sun beside the small wooden house. The creature's skin glowed faintly, calm and content, its massive body curled comfortably across the grass. Dorlan had not seen Vanta this relaxed in years. Daniel was working nearby, repairing a section of fence, unaware of his visitor's identity. He glanced up as Dorlan approached, offering a polite nod, the same greeting he might give any traveler passing through. Afternoon, Daniel said. Can I help you with something? Dorlan hesitated, and used to being addressed so casually. I am here to see the beast, he said simply. Daniel studied him for a moment, noting the quiet authority in his posture despite his plain clothing. You're not one of the soldiers from before, he observed. And you're not the priestess either. No, Dorlan admitted. I am someone else. Something in his tone made Daniel pause, though he didn't press further. Instead, he gestured toward Vanter. Well, he's right there. Doesn't seem to mind visitors much these days, as long as they don't try to drag him off anywhere. Dorlan walked closer, watching as Vanter lifted its head, studying him with quiet golden eyes. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, Vanta lowered its head again, releasing a soft breath, neither afraid nor aggressive, simply calm. It recognizes you, Daniel said, surprised. It should, Dorlan replied quietly. I raised it since it was small enough to fit inside my arms. Daniel's eyes widened slightly as understanding dawned. You're the king. Dorlan nodded, watching Daniel carefully, expecting fear, nervousness, or the formal reverence he was accustomed to receiving. Instead, Daniel simply exhaled, wiping his hands on his trousers. Well, that explains the fancy escort waiting by the road, Daniel said dryly. You want some tea? I was about to make some anyway. For a moment, Dorlan didn't know how to respond. No one had ever offered him tea so casually, as though he were simply another neighbor stopping by. I suppose that would be acceptable, he said finally. They sat together on Daniel's small porch, Vanter resting nearby, while Daniel prepared tea in a modest kettle over a small fire. Dorlan watched the entire process with quiet fascination and used to such simplicity. No servants, no formal preparation, no elaborate ceremony. Just 2 cups, warm water, and quiet conversation. Tell me, Dorlan said eventually, why do you think Vanter came to you? Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. Honestly, I think it just needed somewhere quiet. Somewhere it didn't have to perform or prove anything. Animals can tell when something's wrong, even if they can't explain it. Maybe it just needed a place to breathe. Dorlan's expression grew thoughtful. The palace is far from quiet, he admitted. There is always noise. Politics, rivalry, expectation. I had not considered how heavily that weighs on those who live within it, human or otherwise. Sounds exhausting, Daniel said simply. It is, Dorlan admitted, surprising even himself with his honesty. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping tea as the afternoon sun stretched shadows across the fields. Vanter shifted closer, resting its massive head near both of them, content in a way it hadn't been in years. Finally, Dorlan spoke again. I could order the beast returned to the palace. I have every right as its king. Daniel nodded slowly. You could, but I do not think that would solve anything, Dorlan continued. It would simply return to the same tension it fled from. No, Daniel agreed. Probably not. Dorlan studied Vanter for a long moment, then turned back to Daniel. What would you suggest then? Daniel considered the question carefully, glancing at the peaceful creature beside them. Maybe it doesn't have to be one or the other, he said finally. Maybe Vanter could split time between both places. The palace when it wants company and tradition, and here when it just needs peace and quiet. Dorlan sat back, considering the idea seriously for the first time. It was unconventional, unprecedented, and utterly against everything the old traditions dictated. And yet, watching Vanter rest peacefully for the first time in years, he found himself unable to dismiss it. Perhaps, Dorlan said slowly, tradition is not always wisdom. Daniel smiled slightly, raising his teacup. Sounds like a good start. Neither of them realized how much that single conversation would change the future of their two worlds. The king's return to the palace stirred a wave of curiosity throughout the capital. Rumors spread quickly, though none of them matched the truth. Some claimed Dorlan had gone to punish the humans for harboring the sacred beast. Others believed he had gone to reclaim Vanter by force. Very few imagined the truth, that their king had shared tea on a wooden porch with a simple human farmer and returned home with more questions than answers. Dorlan called for a private council the following morning, gathering only his closest advisors, High Priestess Sela, Commander Vesa, and a handful of trusted ministers. He did not summon the wider court, knowing full well that what he intended to propose would spark fierce resistance. I have seen Vanter, he began, standing at the head of the table rather than sitting upon his throne, a small but deliberate choice. It is well, calm, more peaceful than I have witnessed in years. And the human? Vesa asked carefully. He is unremarkable in the way that matters most, Dorlan said. No ambition, no hidden agenda. Simply a man who wishes to live quietly and help those who need him, whether human or otherwise. Sela nodded slowly. As I suspected, Vanna did not choose him by accident. No, Dorlan agreed. It chose him because our palace could no longer offer what it needed. Peace, safety, a place free from constant tension and rivalry. Lord Thren, seated at the far end of the table, frowned deeply. Your Majesty, surely you do not intend to leave the sacred beast in human care indefinitely. Such a decision would be seen as weakness, both by our own people and by neighboring empires. Dorlan met his gaze firmly. I do not intend to abandon Vanter to human care. I intend to allow it to choose its own path, dividing its time between the palace and the settlement as it wishes. The room fell into stunned silence. That is unprecedented, Sela said carefully. Yes, Dorlan admitted. It is. The court will not accept this easily, Vesa warned. Many will see it as an insult to tradition, or worse, as evidence that the crown has lost control. Dorlan's expression hardened with quiet resolve. Then perhaps it is time our traditions were questioned. I have ruled for 20 years believing that strength meant control, that authority meant fear, and that respect could only be commanded through power. But Vanda showed me something different. It showed me that true peace cannot be forced. It must be earned. The council remained silent, absorbing his words. Finally, Sela spoke again, her voice thoughtful. If this is your decision, Your Majesty, then it must be handled carefully. The court will need reassurance, not rebellion. Then we shall give them reassurance, Dorlan said. Not through force, but through truth. 3 days later, King Dorlan addressed the full royal court, standing before nobles, priests, and ministers who had gathered anxiously to hear his decision regarding the missing sacred beast. Whispers filled the grand hall as he approached the raised platform, his expression calm despite the weight of judgment surrounding him. I have seen Vanter, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I have witnessed its peace, its comfort, and its choice. And I have come to understand something our ancestors may have always known, though we have long forgotten it. A sacred beast cannot be commanded into loyalty. It can only be earned through trust. Murmurs spread through the crowd, some skeptical, others curious. For years, I believed strength meant control, Dorlin continued. I believed authority required constant vigilance, competition, and dominance. But our own sacred beast, the very symbol of our ancestors' blessing, chose peace over power. It chose kindness over control. It chose a simple human farmer over an entire empire's grandeur. The crowd stirred uneasily, though none dared interrupt. I will not force Vanter's return, Dorlin announced. Instead, I grant it freedom to choose its own path, dividing its time between our palace and the human settlement, as it wishes. This is not weakness. This is wisdom, learned through humility. Lord Thryn stepped forward, his expression tight with disapproval. Your Majesty, with respect, this decision undermines centuries of tradition. What message does this send to our people, or to our rivals beyond the Empire? Dorlin turned to face him directly. It sends the message that true strength lies not in control, but in earning trust freely given. If our own sacred beast finds more peace in a simple human home than within our grand palace, perhaps it is not the beast who has failed tradition. Perhaps it is we who have strayed too far from what truly matters. Silence followed his words, heavy and uncertain. Then, slowly, Sela stepped forward, bowing respectfully. The king speaks wisdom rediscovered. I, for one, support this path. One by one, hesitant nods spread through the council, though clear resistance remained among the older nobles. Dorlin expected as much. Change rarely came without struggle. Meanwhile, far from the palace's political storm, Daniel continued his quiet life, unaware of the historic debate unfolding on his behalf. Vanter remained close to his home, content beneath the shade of the old tree, occasionally wandering the fields alongside Biscuit, who had grown surprisingly comfortable with its massive companion. Mira visited often, still amazed by the strange turn of events that had transformed her quiet neighbor into an unlikely figure of interspecies diplomacy. You know, she said one afternoon, watching Vanter rest peacefully nearby, you've become something of a legend around here. The man who tamed the king's sacred beast. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head as he continued tending his garden. I didn't tame anything. It just needed somewhere quiet to rest. That's all. That's exactly the kind of thing a legend would say, Mira teased. Daniel simply smiled, returning to his work, content with his simple life despite the growing attention surrounding him. He had no interest in fame, politics, or royal recognition. He only wanted peace, purpose, and the quiet companionship of those who needed him. Little did he know, that simple wish was about to change the future of two very different worlds. Seasons changed slowly across the colony, marked not by grand events but by small, quiet shifts. The color of the fields, the length of the days, the gentle rhythm of a life lived simply. For Daniel, those months brought more change than he ever expected, though none of it came from ambition or planning. It simply happened, one small step at a time. Vanter had settled into a comfortable pattern, dividing its time between the royal palace and Daniel's modest homestead, just as King Dorlin had promised. Every few weeks, a quiet transport would arrive to carry the beast back to the capital for royal ceremonies and traditions that still required its presence. And every time, without fail, Vanta would return to Daniel's fields shortly after, resting beneath the same old tree as though it had never left. The people of the colony grew used to the sight, though it never stopped feeling remarkable. Children from nearby settlements would sometimes visit, careful and curious, watching the massive glowing creature from a respectful distance, while Daniel calmly explained that Vanter simply needed peace, much like anyone else. King Dorlin visited more often than anyone expected, arriving not as a ruler demanding attention, but as a quiet guest seeking simple conversation. Their friendship, unlikely as it was, grew steadily with each visit. Dorlin found himself drawn not just to Vanter's peace, but to the honesty of Daniel's world, a place free from political maneuvering, hidden agendas, or constant competition. You know, Dorlin said one evening, sitting on the familiar porch as the sun set over the fields, my court still debates this arrangement. Some believe I have weakened the crown by allowing such freedom. Daniel handed him a cup of tea, settling into the chair beside him. And what do you believe? Dorlin considered the question carefully before answering. I believe strength was never about control. It was about earning trust freely given, not commanded through fear. He glanced toward Vanter, resting peacefully nearby. This creature taught me that lesson more clearly than any advisor ever could. Daniel smiled, watching the golden light of sunset reflect off Vanter's glowing skin. Sometimes the simplest lessons are the hardest to learn. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of Dorland's communicator. He glanced at the message, his expression shifting slightly with mild surprise. It seems representatives from several neighboring systems have requested details regarding our new arrangement with Vanter, he said. They are curious how such an unconventional decision has strengthened rather than weakened our empire's reputation. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Strengthened it. Word spreads quickly, Dorland explained. Other rulers have taken notice of how peacefully our sacred beast now thrives, and how positively our people have responded to this change. Some are even considering similar arrangements with their own sacred creatures, inspired by what began here, quite by accident, in your simple home. Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head in disbelief. I really didn't do much. I just gave it somewhere quiet to rest. Sometimes, Dorland said thoughtfully, that is exactly what is needed most. As the months continued, the bond between the human settlement and the Keswick Dominion deepened, built not through formal treaties or political negotiations, but through small, genuine moments of trust and understanding. Daniel's quiet homestead became something of a symbol, representing a new kind of relationship between two very different worlds, one based on kindness rather than control, patience rather than power. Mira often joked that Daniel had accidentally become the colony's most important diplomat, despite never once attending a formal meeting or wearing anything resembling official attire. Daniel simply laughed off the title, preferring instead to focus on his fields, his animals, and the peaceful life he had built for himself. One quiet afternoon, as autumn approached and the fields turned golden beneath a gentle breeze, Daniel sat on his porch, watching Vanter rest peacefully nearby, its massive form curled comfortably in the afternoon sun. Biscuit lay curled beside the great creature, completely unbothered by its size, having long since accepted Vanter as simply another member of their small, unusual family. King Dorland arrived unannounced, as he often did now, dressed in simple traveling clothes rather than royal attire. He settled into his usual chair beside Daniel, accepting a cup of tea with quiet familiarity. You know, Dorland said, watching Vanter with a soft, contented expression, I used to believe a king's greatest strength was his ability to command absolute loyalty through power and tradition. And now? Daniel asked. Dorland glanced toward him, a small, genuine smile crossing his face. Now I believe true strength lies in simplicity, in patience, in creating spaces where even the most sacred, ancient beings can finally feel at home. Daniel smiled softly, raising his cup in quiet agreement. To simple things, then? To simple things, Dorland echoed, clinking his cup gently against Daniel's. As the sun began to set once more over the peaceful fields, casting warm golden light across the land, Vanter let out a slow, contented breath, its glowing skin shimmering softly in the fading light. It had traveled far in search of peace, and after all this time, it had finally found exactly what it needed, not within the grandeur of a palace, but within the quiet warmth of a simple, humble home. And somewhere, deep within the palace halls it still occasionally visited, whispers of change continued to spread, carried gently across the stars by nothing more than the simple, quiet kindness of one ordinary man who had never once tried to be anything extraordinary at all. It was, perhaps, the most fitting ending of all,